So I'm Neil Hartzel here, partner of Freeman, Mathis and Gary, business lawyer that has a lot of experience. In fact, Neil, I think we are kind of in parallel universes in a lot of ways. That I do a lot of the white collar criminal defense, and you also help people in some of those areas in the civil world.
Yes, that is correct. I've worked on civil investigative demands. I've done some people, represented people before grand juries, and I've worked on some very interesting securities related cases, including uh, Chinese based initial public offerings, uh, where they do it here in the United States and then the money somehow disappears. Fascinating case.
That's super interesting because from our standpoint, obviously we represent people in the criminal context, but we what we don't do as a firm is we don't represent them in the civil arena. And as you know, they can face fines, they can face censure, they actually technically be on probation in the criminal setting, but they can also be sued by the government and different state agencies. What types of things do you guys help them in terms of that front to deal with the future compliance issues, but also kind of deal with the lawsuits?
Well, in many of your people on this podcast have heard the name Bernie Madoff, one of the largest scams in human history. And what happened during Bernie Madoff's long run is that the SEC went to visit him,
Yes.
and kind of took his word for various things and didn't dig very deep. Had they done so, the fraud would have been uncovered years ago, and a lot of people would have saved some money. But the net result of that is that the SEC, having been grilled and tarred and feathered in front of Congress because of its failures, the SEC has a much more aggressive enforcement mechanism going on today, and a lot more scrutiny is being given to deals. And if someone has run afoul of securities laws, you can almost guarantee that the SEC will bring its full might to bear in an investigation, in a civil lawsuit. The SEC can bring both civil and criminal charges
That's correct.
against a would-be investor or someone who's traded on insider information. And it's a much tougher world now out there in the investment world. If you're abiding by the rules, terrific. You can continue to invest and try and make money. But if you think you can skirt around the rules, if you think you can bend the rules, if you think your buddy can give you an insider tip, please don't do that
Yeah.
because you're going to get yourself in trouble. And the
That's
penalties
exactly
are
right.
severe.
That's correct, exactly right. Because we see it in the criminal setting, but you're right. There's a lot of investigation that goes on, and it can certainly trigger a criminal investigation too. But there's also a lot of civil suits out there as a result of that. And even when the criminal case is over, many times when a company's put on probation, they have to deal with the compliance issues. So certainly, an attorney with your experience to now figure out what the future of the company is and how to comply with the future issues is super important. I know you also do a lot of work with the False Claims Act. That is obviously a very specialized area. Can you explain a little bit about what it is and what exactly you're doing to help your clients with that?
Sure. Uh, the False Claims Act is very interesting. During the Civil War, the government, the union side of the government fighting against the South, entered into various contracts for supplies, and there was massive fraud that went on back then. Uh, Arms and foods would end up being old, rotted clothes, and the government lost tons of money. And so many people were so outraged by this that the False Claims Act was passed, and it's been around since the 1800s and gone through a few modifications since then, and it's gotten a lot more complicated today. But basically, it means that if you are in a contract or providing services to the U.S. government or getting funding from the U.S. government, and you don't abide by the rules and regulations that apply to your business, and you can be charged with a false claim because your federal money is coming to you in some form or another, be it under a healthcare provider, be it under a construction contractor,
Right.
and you can end up getting sued under the False Claims Act. The False Claims Act has a unique feature that allows for someone inside a particular company called the relator to bring a claim. And the claims are brought under seal so that nobody knows about them.
Mm-hmm.
That means they're brought in federal court and it's sealed up, and the U.S. Attorney's Office then has the opportunity to do its own investigation.
Right.
And the U.S. Attorney's Office can take over the investigation and run the case itself. And if they're successful, the relator can get paid a piece of the recovery. And in some of the drug cases, those recoveries are better than winning a giant lottery jackpot. We've known of cases where the relators have made tens of millions of dollars, or been paid tens of millions of dollars by virtue of the recovery on the False Claims Act. And even if the government chooses not to intervene, the complaint is then unsealed, and a civil case may proceed. So we've represented a number of different companies on these cases. We've also represented a companies in government investigations where there's a settlement before the complaint is made public. And many companies would like to try and do that. If you run afoul of government regulations, you've got the full might of the government against you,
Yep.
and it can be a very challenging fact scenario and very challenging negotiations to try and get something that you can live with if you run afoul of the regulations. So some of the stuff doesn't even make sense.
Exactly.
But that's what happens in this crazy world we're living in today.
Yeah, and you bring up two really great points. One, I don't think people realize the reach of the federal government when they're doing their investigations. I mean, generally on the criminal side, minimum you'll have 4 different departments, one being a lead department that does an investigation. And the other thing is, too, is the False Claims Act and these other acts that, even though it wasn't created for particular prosecutions, a lot of things kind of fall under it over time. So it has really expanded the reach of these acts. It wasn't probably what it was intended for. Obviously, we're not in a country that is just making things for war at the moment. But it really is a situation where the False Claims Act has evolved over time and really kind of been a lot more things that we never thought was going to be falling under the False Claims Act now has. Because, I mean, pretty much, well, I want to say pretty much, there are a lot of companies out there that may not have direct relationships with the federal government, but it could be, a subcontractor. It could be something that they're doing billing. It could just be a portion of their business, and it would still fall under the guise of the False Claims Act, even if you're not just a supplier for the government in itself. And I think a lot of people are kind of get confused by that they think, well, this is an old act. It's not something that applies to me, and it gets them in trouble, really. Now, Neil, I also know that you do a lot of things in terms of like whistleblowers, right? Because that's kind of one of the things that we see a lot now. Where I guess when you brought up the Bernie Madoff example, it was really his son that kind of turned him in. It wasn't anyone that was working at the company, even though he was being investigated for a period of time. And it almost seemed like some of the whistleblowers that tried to come forward, the government wasn't really believing them or kind of following up in that time. What type of stuff that do you do with the whistleblower investigations and representing clients in that way?
Well, a whistleblower is a very broad-based term, and it can cover a lot of different areas. In the False Claims Act context, that's somebody who knows or suspects that a particular company or group of individuals are not playing by the rules and are bending the rules,
right,
and not complying with the regulations to make sure that the government is getting what it pays for, or the government is getting what it has contracted for. So that's a typical scenario. You can also find them in the employment context where someone within a company is aware of some discrimination, be it sexual, be it gender or race orientation, and will go to the state agency and start a complaint. That's a little more uncommon. But when you hear the term whistleblower, that's typically used in connection with the False Claims Act investigation. The term whistleblower and key tam are basically the same in terms of the Whistleblower Act. And you raised a very good point, Jason. Some people think, oh, that's from the Civil War. Well, it is from the Civil War, but it's as active today as it's ever been. It is a huge moneymaker for the
Yes.
government.
Yes. Yes.
And I don't know what the statistics are. It's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more, per year that the government recovers on False Claims Act investigations. And they can be very interesting and very esoteric interpretations of what a particular regulation
Yeah.
says. And some of the regulations aren't that clear.
They're not
And we,
at
we
all.
were involved, we were involved in an investigation recently where it appears that the government's interpretation of a particular regulation changed during the course of the investigation,
Oh my
which made it
goodness.
enormously challenging to try and resolve the matter, which ultimately was, but painful.
Yeah, and whistleblower is certainly a big term. I know another area that you practice in the civil context is not only insider trading but also antitrust and price rigging. So that's another area. Well, we usually see that start of those investigations in two different areas, right? It could either be someone inside who's worried that themselves are going to get in trouble, so they become a whistleblower, or it can a lot of times be a competitor that says, "Oh, this is interesting. I don't know why I keep losing out on all these bids." And sometimes the public corruption cases start from there too, right? Like it could just be individuals say, "You know what? I think I'm getting really competitive bids, but I keep getting someone else that keeps getting the contract." So we see that from two different standpoints: people either working inside the company or outside the company. But we do see some antitrust things going on in terms of price rigging, which includes not only just rigging prices, but also people trying to split up territories, which is not allowed under that act. And I know you do also a lot of representation in that area also.
The antitrust field is really interesting.
Certainly is.
So how did it start? Just very briefly, you are familiar with Exxon and ExxonMobil and the Getty oil company. Well, virtually all of the oil companies in the United States today started as Standard Oil by John D. Rockefeller. And for those of you who are interested, read his biography. It is fascinating. It's a guy who started basically with nothing and cornered the market on the oil producing in the United States and built up an enormous fortune. And the government had eventually thought it was too big and made him break it up. And those were the sort of anti-monopoly laws that give rise to today's antitrust. And antitrust is the United States promotes competition. We're still, as of this speaking, a capitalist society
Right.
where companies are supposed to have a fair uh, ground on which to market their products and sell to consumers. And there's all kinds of nuances to antitrust law. That essentially, two competitors can't get together and fix prices.
That's exactly right.
Um, and they can't fix price in particular territories, or they can't divide up territories. All these things can lead to antitrust violations. And I won't say there's infinite different issues that arise in antitrust, but it's enormously complex, and every situation is different. But we represent a number of different companies in various antitrust cases, monopoly cases, some price fixing. I was just involved with a matter involving some individuals who were trying to carve up territory as to who was gonna sell in this particular territory. Can't do that, folks.
Cannot do that. That's exactly right.
And the penalties can be destroy your business as well as your reputation. So we play by the rules, folks. You again, like with the securities markets, like with the government getting involved with a QTAM or a whistleblower case, when you run afoul of the U.S. government on an antitrust case, you have a major problem. It's far better to abide by the rules, do not get into price fixing or anti-competitive conduct under the antitrust rules, and you'll have a long and happy business life.
Yeah, you
As
got to play
opposed
the long game,
as
right,
opposed
Neil?
to spending time in investigation hearings, depositions, and antitrust suits.
That's right. So, Neil, thanks for coming on today. I really appreciate your time. I would love for you to come back and do some case studies, and we can talk about specific situations and kind of comment on cases. But thank you for coming in and spending the time with me today.
Thank you for having me, Jason. Always a pleasure. Always very interesting.